When we talk about competence and we talk about building that sense of, oh no, wait, I can do this. I can rely on myself. It's so much more important than that task there in that moment. It's about building that self-reliance for later. It's about, obviously, the dopamine thing we've been talking about. And it's about that sense of, oh no, I don't need to look to someone else for that. When our kids come to us and they're like, do you like this picture? What do you think of this picture? We automatically are like, oh, that's the best thing I've ever seen in my life. One of the greatest things that we can do is we can turn it around and say, well, what do you think of your picture? Or, kid comes off the soccer field, how did I play? And you turn it around and you say, how do you think you played? How do you feel about today's game? Did you have fun? Was there anything you felt like you did really well today? That sense of building some internal compass, not just for that competence stuff, but for quality is so important because, they're going to need to know, not just by what everyone else says is something that they've done of worth. They need to know, oh no, this thing I did is of worth here because I know what that means for me.
Welcome back to another episode of Shifting Schools. So great to be here with Tricia today as we launch our mini-series on SEL or social emotional learning. Tricia, I think this is the perfect time of the year to be talking about how are we setting up the structures in our classroom around this thing called SEL that we know we are focused on. We are still very heavily focused on it, as we always should be, coming out of the pandemic, as we're constantly trying to, bring kids back into the fold. And we're talking about all the things that have happened over the last couple of years in schools. And I think this is a great episode to kind of kick off our mini series all about social emotional learning.
That's right. I think social for schools, is there a more important dynamic than that child, parent, caretaker, teacher dynamic? And today's guest gives us so much advice and guidance in terms of really cultivating a strong relationship there and how that's going to drive learning. Jessica Lahey is the author of the book, The Gift of Failure: How the Parents Learn to Let Go so their children can succeed. And she just drops so much wisdom. I really appreciate she talks about from the start of the school year, what can we do to perhaps focus more on goals, less so than grades, and how we can, of course, really be thinking about failure as not just a necessary part of the process, but perhaps like where the sweet spot of learning is at. What stood out to you from our conversation today, Jeff?
Well, I think it was very interesting. She talks about, she wrote these books and they are, the titles of them talk about for parents and caregivers. And she even admits, she's like, I think they're more for educators than they are for the parent community. And I think that's part of the wisdom that she drops here today. Everything that we talk about today isn't new. There's nothing in here that is new. The ideas in here are just things that we need to remember and based in the research that she has done. Like the things that we share in this podcast, the things that the wisdom that she's dropping is based in research that she's done and in the consultancies that she does with school districts. And I love this idea, and where I stand on this, but this idea of positioning failure. And I love that, Tricia, that you came up with that. How do we make sure from the beginning of the school year, we are supporting our kids in understanding that failure is a part of the learning process. And I am here to support you in the learning process. But we all are going to fail at some point this year. And it's what you do with that failure that makes you be successful afterwards. And I think that, to me, when we talk about emotional learning, is understand the emotions that go with that and understand that those emotions lead to the struggle that we call learning. And that, to me, I think is a huge part as we roll out this mini series. I'm sure going to hear this throughout all of these episodes. But just, when we're talking about that, how are we setting up the structures in our classrooms that support things like talking about growth over grades, talking about failure? We need to make sure that that is a key component to our classroom culture if that is something that we truly want kids to get out of it. If we don't set it up and we don't talk about it in our classroom, it's not going to just happen. And I think that's one of the things that we just have to remember as we're setting up classroom cultures this year.
And again, I would say, what are we doing, just to push back gently on what you said? The ideas aren't necessarily new to us. Like Jeff, you and I have been supporting learning in students for decades. But for parents and caretakers who I think have been misinformed, sometimes I feel like rigor has been misused, or people feel like they have to hold perfection as the standard. I have coached and worked with some parents, I know you have too, where they think like, if I am just the firmest disciplinarian, my child will catch up with that. And I'm going to quote from the introduction of Jessica's book, where she writes, decades of studies and hundreds of pages of scientific evidence point to one conclusion that sounds crazy, but it absolutely works. If parents back off the pressure and anxiety over grades and achievement and focus on the bigger picture, a love of learning and independent inquiry, grades will improve and test scores will go up. And I do think for parents, caretakers, for many of them, that will be brand new. And schools, like, what are you doing to inform parents and caretakers? And I really do think we have to give them multiple entry points into learning about that. So this is a book that I think for schools that have parent caretaker book clubs, highly, highly would recommend this text for that, because I think there's some unlearning that parents and caretakers need to take on in terms of like what's going to support motivation for your child. Because there's been, I think, a lot of bad advice out there.
Well, I think you bring up a great point. I mean, if you have a PTA or a PTO at your school who does book clubs like this, what a great way. And how cool would it be that if the PTA or PTO was reading the same book as the teachers? Yeah. Like, what if we started to break down those, that parent, guardian, educator, so that we're all understanding here what the science says behind motivation, what the science says behind learning, which is really what the book is about, right? Is supporting kids. And that's what we're all in the business of doing. As your parent, guardian, as an educator, we're all here for the kiddos and trying to, support them in what they do. So
I love that, Jeff. I would say too, if you do have that PTA, PTO, take the link to this episode and share it with them. I think that might help drive some curiosity around this conversation and the book. Let me tell folks a little bit more about our special guest. Jessica Lahey is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure. That's what we're here to discuss today. Over 20 years, Jess has taught every grade from 6th to 12th in both public and private schools, and spent 5 years teaching in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents in Vermont. She has written about education, parenting, and child welfare for The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and her bi-weekly column, The Parent-Teacher Conference, ran for 3 years at The New York Times. She designed and wrote the educational curriculum for Amazon Kids' award-winning animated series, The Stinky and Dirty Show, and was a 2019 Pushcart Prize nominee.
Wow.
Yeah, she's done a lot of things, so we're humbled and honored to have her here on the show, and hope that this episode is useful for our educator audience and perhaps for them to pass on to some of the parents and caretakers that they're working and partnering with this year too.
Yeah, so great episode. We can't wait for you to hear it. But real quick, here is a word from today's show sponsors. We are thrilled to have this mini-series on SEL sponsored by our good friends at Mackin. Now more than ever, we're all aware of the challenges our students face and the need to create an environment where empathy, resilience, and understanding are paramount. Mackin understands this and has curated an incredible selection of SEL books that allow students to find age-appropriate titles that speak to them personally. Whether it's about making friends, coping with stress, finding confidence, or fostering understanding, these books can help break down barriers and facilitate conversations that might not have been possible otherwise. From bullying to determination, from anxiety to mindfulness, Mackin's selections cover a wide spectrum of sensitive topics. Organized by interest level from pre-K to grade 12, there's something for every educator and every student. We all know how important it is to connect with students and create a safe space for them. Mackin's SEL titles are more than just books. They're tools for building relationships, responsible decision-making, self-management, and so much more. So educators, If you're looking for ways to enrich your students' lives and help them navigate these challenging times, head over to mackin.com, create a free account, and explore their vast curated list of genres, including SEL titles, and let's work together to strengthen our schools and communities. For more than 40 years, Mackin has taken great pride in providing an unmatched level of service to all their customers, ensuring that educators and students have access to the tools they need to teach, learn, and grow. Thanks to Mackin for supporting educators and students all over the world. All right, and with that, here is Jessica Lahey, the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed. And with that, on with the show.
So excited for this conversation. I actually have my copy of your book here with me. In part because I wanted to actually start this conversation with a quote from your book, The Gift of Failure. And readers who have your copy or picking up your copy, this is coming to us from page 36, where you write, quote, "Encourage competence in your child whenever possible. Competence and mastery are incredible motivators," end quote. Can you say more to our listeners about the power of cultivating an appreciation for competence?
I love this question because I would have given you one answer when I first wrote this book, but I have since written a book about preventing substance use in kids. And this question has taken on a whole other life because this competence piece is so important, not just for learning and motivation and engagement in schools, but it's incredibly important for preventing substance use in kids. So competence and confidence, I talk a lot about the difference between those two things. You know, confident kids, great, whatever. There's a lot of optimism. I love optimism. I'm a very optimistic person, but confidence is this like, you know, this sense of like, oh, it's going to be fine, right? Either because my parents said it's going to be fine, or, you know, I have this feeling that it's going to be okay. Whereas competence is confidence based on actual skills, skill building, having things that you have tried and mastered, and you have a sense that you can do that thing. You're building on that past library of skills that you've built, which for learning is so important. It allows students to rely on themselves, they get a little bit more through that process of becoming competent. They learn how to feel frustrated and not flip out and sort of, manage that difficult emotion. I hate being frustrated too. From the perspective of substance use disorder, though, one of the best ways we can help kids get a boost of dopamine is in the brain is through mastering something. Kids are, especially they're depending on their personality type, kids are just craving those dopamine hits. We all want that next great, post or that, that like or whatever that thing is. And that gives us dopamine, but so does building something, a skill in yourself. And I think one of the things that we have leaned towards in the past couple of years has been, the easy dopamine hits of the next social media post or whatever. But these dopamine hits that are built through, struggle and mastery are lasting, not just from the perspective of here's that dopamine you get in that moment, but from the perspective of each time I am reminded that I know how to do that thing. It's an additional hit of dopamine, which is, really, really important for helping kids understand that you can access that rush of that feeling of, all that good stuff that dopamine gives us. We can get that from ourselves if we'll just let kids, become competent and not just confident.
Well, and I appreciate, you bring up this journey towards competence, because I think that word has a lot of weight to it. And, there are small ways, and you might laugh because my wife is away on a work trip this week. And a thing that I have been wanting to do all year is actually just reorganize our sock drawer. If my dog gets a hold of a sock, there are holes in it. It's, But it's like I've just been putting those back in the sock drawer, and for months now it's been like on my mind, just reorganize it. And of course, when I finally did it this week, it took 15 minutes. I had been like stressing over this thing that I had loaded up actually a new audio book to listen to during this chore, and I'm like, I didn't even get through the introduction of the book. And so you talk a lot about parents, caretakers letting go of perfection in order to let their children like actually support the household, right? Get involved at that level. And I really appreciate though that you talk about how it isn't easy. You reference like that idea of letting go, of course, is tremendously hard. And the book itself has lots of advice, but I'm wondering if you want to just talk about some of the when we talk about developing competence, it doesn't mean like, I mean, literally, I did feel a boost of dopamine after I finally did that chore, but all it was 15 minutes.
Right. For me, this dopamine question is really important to me, mainly because I'm in recovery. I'm an alcoholic. I just celebrated my 10th year of recovery. And that, to me, has been a journey of learning to rely on myself for my own sort of, my own highs. And, that part of, I highly recommend, by the way, if anyone wants to understand more about dopamine, to read Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation. It's a really important book, I think, for people just to understand themselves, to understand their kids, whatever. But this whole process with the whole competence thing, I have 2 kids, and every single time, and, lots and lots of students that I've taught over the years, but every time I start thinking about this, this journey to competence, and I start losing sight of the big picture, and I'm focused on the moment and how I want something done, and I want it done perfectly and not the way they're doing it. And I have to think over and over and over again, do I want this done perfectly right now in this moment, or do I want my kid to be able to do it themselves next time? And ditto with my students, right? I don't want the students. There's a through line here, because the kids who are having trouble relying on themselves, and the kids who aren't allowed to sort of pitch in at home and be a part of a working household are also the kids who tend to you hand something out in class and their hand goes up in the air before they've ever even looked at the instructions, because they're so positive that they're stuck already before they even take a breath. So all of that is tied together. And the last part of this, I think that's really important, is when we talk about competence and we talk about building that sense of, oh no, wait, I can do this. I can rely on myself. It's so much more important than that task there in that moment. It's about building that self-reliance for later. It's about, obviously, the dopamine thing we've been talking about. And it's about that sense of, oh no, I don't need to look to someone else for that. When our kids come to us and they're like, do you like this picture? What do you think of this picture? We automatically are like, oh, that's the best thing I've ever seen in my life. One of the greatest things that we can do is we can turn it around and say, well, what do you think of your picture? Or, kid comes off the soccer field, how did I play? And you turn around and you say, how do you think you played? How do you feel about today's game? Did you have fun? Was there anything you felt like you did really well today? That sense of building some internal compass, not just for that competence stuff, but for quality, is so important, because, they're going to need to know, not just by what everyone else says is something that they've done of worth. They need to know, oh no, this thing I did is of worth here because I know what that means for me. And that's been really, in fact, I had this conversation with another author yesterday. She's had to build a pretty thick skin recently, just because authors sometimes need to have a thick skin when we put stuff out there. And she said, I've been able to let go of what everyone else thinks of my work, because I know I'm doing some of the best work of my life right now. And that has to be enough for me right now. I can't let other people dictate whether or not my work is worthy. And that's something that we start teaching kids from a really young age, if we're allowing them to, weigh in on their own internal vision of whether or not something's good.
I really like that. And I think there's so much to take away for educators who are listening to this, and just that moment right there of how do you turn the question around in our classrooms to say, well, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
Was this some of your best work? You flunked the test. Well, why do you think you flunked the test? Well, I didn't study. Well, that's great. That's good for you to know. Or you aced the test. Why did you ace the test? Well, I studied really hard and I put forth some effort, and there's a reason why I'm seeing the outcome that I'm seeing. And I think that's something very critical to be thinking about.
That the two places I was just thinking about in schools where that opportunity is just opened wide for you is, number one, student-led parent-teacher conferences. That is like,
I love that.
The best ones, in my opinion, the best student-led parent-teacher conferences are, Freudian slip there, are the ones where we ask kids not just to come up with examples of their best work to show off during that meeting, but to say, also, I want you to pick an example of something where you really learned a lot. And that thing can be something that you did terribly on, because that's going to show us where you grew. And, I've talked about this in a bunch of interviews. When we moved here to Vermont from New Hampshire, I was in charge of sort of figuring out the schools and, what school does what and all that other kind of stuff. Years of education journalism sort of put me in that seat. And the school that I picked, the school district that I picked for our kids, was a school that uses standards-based assessments and formative assessment. Lots of standards-based stuff, like, okay, do they actually know the skills? Yes or no? And those formative assessments have been an incredible opportunity, because formative assessments, for those of you in the audience who don't understand fully what those are, it's, frequent low-stakes assessments that teachers or parents can give their kids to understand what they know and what they don't know, so that when you do those big summative assessment, there are no surprises. But the best thing about the formative assessment is, if a kid tanks something, really doesn't do well on it, then the school that my daughter went to would give her this form where she needed to fill out what she thought she knew, what she didn't know, that whole metacognition stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you feel you need help in reinforcing these skills? What can we do to help you? All of that stuff that makes her pause, think back on what she's done, understand what she did know and what she didn't know, and what she overestimated and where she sort of fell short, and give that back in the form of writing to someone who can help her. That is an incredibly rich opportunity for that kind of growth. And so I'm a huge proponent of both standards-based grading, if you want to even call it grading, and formative assessment. I can't I can't talk about it enough. I think it's so important.
Well, and I am vibing with you so hard right now, because that's all I ever did as a teacher in the classroom.
Yeah.
I only ever did student-led conferences before they were a thing back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we always created growth portfolios, right? You had to choose 3 things from I was a 4th grade teacher, 3 things from English that shows your growth, 3 things from math that shows your growth. So you're not picking your 3 A's. You're picking things that, here's one that I struggled on, here's how I improved. And every entry had a reflective slip with it that the parents then could see of the kid reflecting on, here's what I'm proud of myself of, here was my next step. And then they flip to their next example of, here's what I'm proud of, here's my next step. Yeah. And the cool part is I got more feedback from parents saying, I've never heard my children talk about their own work this way. And that makes them proud, because they know, their kids are 4th grade. They're not perfect. They're not doing algebra. They shouldn't be. They're 4th graders. But you could see those steps, and you could see kids gaining, and it made parents proud to even hear their children say, I'm making strides this way. I'm not perfect yet, but I am making strides, and I can celebrate my successes and also still see my shortcomings of what my next step should be.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a critical piece to everything that we're talking about here about supporting kids as they grow and mature.
Yeah. One of the things that was really cool was so both of my kids are, one of my kids is in college, one has graduated from college, but when the younger one was looking at colleges, she watched her brother go through this. She knows what our priorities are around college. It's about finding the right fit for the way they want to become and learn and grow and all that sort of stuff. And, when she was touring schools, the questions she was asking about how her learning would be supported were so great because it showed
Yeah.
me that she had learned how she learns best. She learns
Yes.
best through independent inquiry with, so the school she goes to, the college she goes to is a lot of independent inquiry, a lot of sort of a panel of sort of advisors who help her shape how she's moving towards goals. It's a smaller school. She definitely needed a smaller school, but all of these things were, she was able to articulate that she needed that. And she was able to go through a list when she was doing all of that sort of like, hey, welcome to so-and-so college. She was able to sort of figure out that. And the two schools she landed on were two schools that are very heavy on sort of that mode of learning. And it's been really fun to watch her figure that out. I mean, for me, it was like, okay, if I've done nothing else right, I've at least helped her figure out how to ask for what she needs and how to recognize a learning environment that really works for her. And if it doesn't work for her, either say, no, that's not for me, or work to change it. That's, as
Yeah.
far
And
as
so
I'm
she can
concerned,
be
that was,
successful
yeah.
in her life. Like if you have those skills, you're going to be successful because you can put yourself into situations that are best for you. And that to me is what we want, right? That we call that lifelong learning. If we want, we use this word all the time in education. We want our children to be lifelong learners. Well, that means that they need to know how they learn best. That's the only way you become a lifelong learner is if you know what you need to be successful. Then it applies to university. It applies to jobs. It applies to picking a partner for life. It applies to so many things. This is what I need to be successful in life. And I think that's such a critical skill of, we constantly focus on it in education. And I hope that if nothing else, listeners out of this episode understand that, okay, maybe this is something I needed to hear right now because, this is coming out in the fall. I'm setting up structures in my classroom. How am I making sure that I'm getting kids reflective and being able to be confident in understanding who they are? I think it's such a critical piece to what K-12 education truly is about, that I love it. I want to switch gears
Can I just add just one quick thing is I thought that The Gift of Failure was a parenting book when I started writing it.
Yeah.
The big joke was on me is it was a book for teachers. I mean, it's for parents and all that sort of stuff. And that's how it's marketed. And that's how my publisher markets it. And that's great, whatever. This is an education book for me because my teaching changed so much after I wrote this book and after I learned what I learned about engagement, motivation, how to everything. I dumped so many of the methods that I had been using that I thought I was being really thoughtful about. But a lot of the teaching methods that I was using just were not working best for their learning. They were working great for me for my teaching, but they were not working great for them for their learning. And so I was a very different teacher after writing Gift of Failure than I was before.
I love that because I think that leads into the next question, which is, your book is very clear about this idea of autonomy supported parenting. And this idea that that's not a free for all, but your advice for parents and caregivers is to value limits as structure. I love that, right? Value limits as structures. Can you walk our listeners through a little bit about an example of what that might look like? And again, I think to your point, this isn't just about parents and caregivers, but in our classrooms as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of this sort of comes out of that idea that, we know that, for example, toddlers need limits. We need to say, no, you can't eat that, or you can't, play with that. That's too dangerous. You can't put your hands on the stove. Those are hard limits, right? And we're not going to walk back and say, okay, sure, put your hand on the stove. That's probably not the best way to parent in that situation or to teach, right? So there are limits like in a chemistry lab, there are limits, there's no mixing two chemicals before blah, 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 blah. And you wear your safety goggles and stuff like that. But within that, there is play, there is creativity, there are opportunities to sort of do things differently up to those limits. And I think, from my classroom, there is sort of depending on how you talk about this for my kids, it was really important for my own children that they understood that most of my limits were and my rules were around safety and making sure that they're safe and that I'm protecting their safety when they can't do it for themselves, that kind of thing. And in my classroom, we talk a lot about sort of those first day, like we're going to make sure that we are polite to each other, that we don't denigrate each other, the respect and stuff like that.
Sure.
But it's also really important that within that framework, they understand that that respect goes two ways. I had a student come to me once to tell me she was dropping my Latin class because she felt like the class wasn't working for her, that she wasn't learning very much. And here were her beefs with my class. And you know what? She was 100% right. And I learned a ton about what I was doing wrong in that classroom and how I was not teaching to all of my students. I was teaching to a narrow slice of them. But she understood that one of the rules in my classroom is you don't, that there are learning opportunities for everyone, not just the students, that formative assessments are formative both for them and for me as a teacher. If you all fail this quiz, my answer can't be what's wrong with you people. How are you people not getting all of this right? We've done this. And this was something that actually happened to me. This was a real experience. I gave a quiz 3 times. They all failed it 3 times. And I'd used that quiz for years and years. What is wrong with you people? And then it's like, it hadn't even occurred to me that the problem was me. It hadn't even occurred to me. And that's why that word formative is so important to me, that, you know, the respect goes both ways. This is formative for you as much as for me. And so if you feel like this, the learning is not happening in the classroom, or you don't feel included, or you don't feel engaged, bring that to me as well. And I think that those limits are reassuring to toddlers and teens alike. And understanding that there are limits is something that, you know, we have to realize as a parent is one of the most important things we do. But there has to be, you know, some room within those limits to move and be creative and all that sort of stuff.
And I love that your book really focuses too on the way in which we communicate them. I mean, the text is really rich with lots of anecdotes, lots of stories that I think make your premise of, you know, failure being a gift kind of comes to life. And one of the communication partnership dynamics that you talk about in the book is the parent-teacher partnership. So it's, you know, it's really interesting to me that you feel like in your mind now, this is an educator book. Like I feel like it would be such a great school community PD text for parents, caretakers, and teachers, because that partnership is tough. I don't think anybody would venture to say it's easy, but it is so essential. And in your section of the book entitled Parent-Teacher Partnerships, you write about protecting a child's right to fail. And I was cheering during that section, because as an educator, I've believed that for so long. I mean, we've already been talking in this conversation about how that right to fail, that's, you know, a sweet spot for learning. And also we all need to learn how to fail too. None of us are going to live a life where failure is absent from it. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the right to fail and why we need to protect that right. And, you know, how does it help everybody involved in that partnership, not just one person?
Well, to the first part of your question, so I have essentially the coolest job in the world, which is to get curious about something and go research the heck out of it and then sort of translate it for people that don't necessarily want to do all the research. So what I get to do now, most of my time is spent now traveling, for example, to a school. And usually what I do is I talk to the kids during the day, talk to them about, I get a little conspiratorial with them, talk to them about how, even if you feel like you're being very, very controlled, here are some ways to sort of regain control of your own learning so that you feel like some of it is yours, because frankly, that's where you get really great engagement, is when you feel it's their learning. Anyway, so I sort of prime them for some words, some vocabulary that they might hear later, because in the afternoon, I talk to the teachers. I do professional development sort of right after school. And then that evening, I speak to the community, to the parents. And I do a couple of things. I give all of the kids my email address and I ask them, I'm like, look, I'm talking to your parents tonight at 7. So between now and 7, email me with things you need for your parents to know, that you feel like they can't hear because they're too defensive or because they get mad or whatever it is. And then I also teach them about I statements, like when you do X, it makes me feel Y, so that, the sort of statements that don't really lend themselves to be getting defensive kind of stuff. And then in the evening, I have the kids' own words in terms of what it is they feel like their parents need to hear. And I can say, look, if your kid comes to you with a statement like, when you do X, it makes me feel Y, you need to understand that this is something they really, really, really want you to hear. And this is important. And then we also have this sort of shared vocabulary, the word formative, the word competence, the word autonomy. All of these words I need for the parents to hear. I need the kids to hear them. I need the teachers to hear them. And I need for the parents to hear them. So there's some shared platform for everyone moving forward to give the kids a little more autonomy, help them own their learning a little bit more, get engaged for the sake of the engagement. And there's a whole bunch of other language in there. But it really does take all three of those parties to have a shared understanding about what learning is and how we get there. And if that means that I have to piss off a few parents, which always happens, and I'm cool with that. I mean, often schools bring me in because I'm like, for example, I was in a place where a school was moving from A through F grading to a more standards-based approach. And they had me come in to sort of explain to parents why this was a really good thing, because the parents were flipping out. They're like, what is this thing? I don't understand it, but when we can, and this is sort of what I also tell teachers who are like, how do I get parents to understand that this is about the learning and not about a grade, is to bring everything back to process. Like, less talk about end product, more talk about process. This works for kids who are especially kids who are really anxious. The more they're circling the drain around the difference between 89 and a 91, the more we talk about process, the better. With teachers, we understand it's all about the process. It's not about, next week's test. It's about, what do we really want you to know 5 years from now? And for the parents, it's just so easy to get stuck in these daily emergencies of this grade, this trophy, this soccer practice. How many minutes did they get to play today? That kind of stuff. And so to move everyone back to that idea of process and off of end product, that takes talking to everyone. You can't just talk to one side and hope that it, by osmosis moves out. That's not how this stuff works. So it's really fun. It's really challenging. That's three very different audiences, but one message about how important the process of learning is rather than that end product.
And I love what you're saying. I mean, it really is getting everybody on the same page, right? Students, parents, children. And we talk a lot about failure. And one of the, we're all consultants here. So we understand that part of our job as consultants is to go in and sometimes, for lack of a better term, piss people off, because that's why you're bringing the consultant in, because you can get mad at me. I'm leaving.
Right.
You can be mad at me. Where a teacher can't say those things or a school cannot lay this out there. But as a consultant, you can say things and push in ways that sometimes organizations
and that includes biting the hand that feeds me sometimes, because sometimes what I'm hearing as I walk around the school and talk to kids during the day and talk to teachers and blah, 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 what I'll often hear is, I've got to push back and say, okay, do you use a portal and is it open 24/7? And are you giving any feedback on how it should be used? Or did you just deploy it and hope everyone would know how to use it? Or, do you do any formative assessments, or is everything you're doing big cumulative assessments? Right. And why are you doing it this way? And I'm sorry to piss you off, and especially considering you're the one who paid for me to come here, but your teachers, this is what I'm hearing from your teachers and from your students and from your parents. And it takes this entire community to spark change. Not, one teacher can't change the whole thing on their own, which is what can be one of the most frustrating things about understanding the research behind learning. And that's the other thing that's been really cool is, we've really only started to understand how the human brain learns deeply in this past 30 years or so. And as that research trickles down to the people who need it the most, some people learn that stuff earlier than others. And if there's one teacher on the whole faculty who understands the benefit of a really important idea and no one else does, they can feel like they're just shouting into the wind, and it can be really hard.
So true. And I love this idea of failure. I think we forget a lot of times that we learn through failure. I mean, it really is. And failure is everything that happens. I've got this great slide that I love to use. Failure, and I love it with kids. Failure is everything that happens right before you succeed.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're going to fail. Like I was a baseball player. I'm going to go 0 for 10 before I go 4 for 4.
Yeah.
Right? And it's through the failures of going 0 for 10 that allowed me to go 4 for 4. Or my wife and I are working on a house. I'm going to electrocute myself 4 times before I say, you know what, you really should just shut off the breaker, right? I'm going to fail before I become successful, because it's through the failure that the learning happens. And then when you become successful in that, that's the dopamine hit, right?
Yeah.
But pushing through that, I think a lot of times we take that failure away. We take that failure. Don't want our kids to feel bad. We don't want them to have failure. We want them to be successful. We want that 91 and not the 89 because we want them to be successful.
Well,
and we get caught up a lot in that. And we take, I feel like we take those failures away from kids sometimes.
Well, and also what's so hard about that is we have this incredible reluctance to model that ourselves. Whereas,
agreed.
So what's so fascinating is, and this is a story that only came out after Gift of Failure happened because it's about that book. So The Gift of Failure. Okay. I wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2013 or whatever, and it went viral. And this book I sold this book based on that viral article, Why Parents Need to Let Their Children Fail. And I was paid a lot of money to write this book, and it was really high stakes, and it's been sold in like 17 languages. So I'm now expected to write a book. I've never written a book before, right? I'm a journalist. I had written in like 1,200 word blocks. I'd never written a 70,000 page book before. So I finished the book. I hand it in. I have fantasies that my editor is going to be like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. There are no edits needed. What happened instead was my editor summoned me to New York. I don't live in New York. And my editor summoned me to New York. Not good. And essentially what she said to me was, this book in its current form is unpublishable. We can't put this out there. And I think what we might need to do is hire a ghostwriter. And, as a writer, this was like, I can't believe I can talk about this now without vomiting, because the first couple of times I couldn't.
Yeah.
So I said in that moment, I'm like, okay, well, I have a big decision to make, because we can hire a ghostwriter and that person's name will never appear on the book. It can be a big secret, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Or I can buck up and I can listen to all the feedback about everything that's wrong with this book. And I begged for 2 probationary chapters. It turns out we had some time to edit. We were in pretty good shape. So I asked for those 2 probationary chapters. I said, give me those 2 chapters. Tell me everything that's wrong with this book and I will fix it. So I did. I had these big checklists of what to do, what not to do, all that sort of stuff. And those 2 chapters ended up being the whole book, and we didn't need a ghost. Now, if you were to ask my kids what my proudest moment in my career is, they will not tell you that it was when that book hit the New York Times bestseller list, which, by the way, it never would have done that in its first form. They will tell you that when I wrote my second book and I handed the rough draft in, there were so few edits to be made on that book that my editor talked about pushing the release date up, because what I had done was learned from that first book, made a system for not making the same mistake twice, had a checklist I paid attention to. And so when she came back to me and said, you clearly have just internalized all of these mistakes, failures from the first book and have really learned from them. That by far the biggest moment in my entire career. And as a perfectionist, first child, straight A, blah, 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 was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Hearing that I sucked, hearing that I couldn't do it, hearing that my book was awful, I wanted to just curl up and die. But it gives me some street cred when I talk to my students about editing and how important editing is and all of that sort of stuff. And, I'm the thing also that I'm proud of is that my kids know how hard that was. Yeah. And my kids know how proud I am of that second
work that you
book
did.
not needing
Yeah.
that work. Yeah. And, I would prefer that be in my obituary than, New York Times bestselling author. That's great and everything. But the fact that I learned how to do this thing that I love so much is way more important to me.
It's a great
Jessica,
story.
that's beautiful. And first of all, I would never in my wildest dreams have guessed that. When I picked up a copy of your book, I couldn't put it down. It was one of those books that I read in a single setting.
You would have hated the first version. Okay. It was awful.
But I love that you shared that with us, because I think it's such an important message, and I am so happy that I jotted down the page that you wrote this, because I pulled it up, because what you are also talking about so perfectly encapsulates what you have on page 192, which is you talk to parents and caretakers about the need to model enthusiasm for learning. And this is your quote: "Your attitudes towards education will be your child's attitude." And for your kids to have seen that, for you to share that with others is huge. And I need to say, not everyone is at the level of writing, of course, that you are at, where they're going to have an article in The Atlantic go viral. For other parents and caretakers who want to do something similar in terms of again, taking on this challenge, hey, your attitude for education will become the attitude that your children have. For the person out there who doesn't have the challenge to turn a viral article into a book, can you speak to maybe some other ways that, again, we're really communicating our enthusiasm for learning for the young folks in our lives?
My starting place is this. In the book, I talked about the fact that we tend not to talk that much about grades in our house, but we do talk a ton about goals. And what we still do, my kids are now 19 and 24, and we still do this. When we can get everyone together at the dinner table, whether that's on a holiday or whatever, because my 24-year-old lives in New York now, we write down, I would love to do it once a season. It doesn't happen that as often anymore, but we write down three goals for the coming season. And one of them always has to be a reach or challenging or painful or, stretching in some way. And they're very personal. I can't have any input into my kids' goals. I can't say things like, wouldn't it be great if doing well in math was one of your goals? That we can't do that, because these things have to be very personal. Because when a goal is personal to you, if in 3 months, because this is the ideal situation, in another 3 months when we do this again, we also talk about how that last set of goals went. How'd you do? And also with little kids, especially, well, with anyone, but especially with littler kids, you have to talk about, you can have a big, wonderful goal, but you also have to talk about the little individual steps you have to do to get to that goal. And that helping kids figure that out, that's called self-directed executive function, when you sort of figure out the small goals to the big goal. That's one way we do that. Is I say, look, this is on my list again this season. I screwed it up last time around, but who the heck cares? It was my personal goal. Our family may be the only 4 people who know that I didn't attain that goal. It's my goal. And then, but for parents in general, it's things like, I was at a school in Texas, and this woman said, can you give me a list? My kids don't like to read for pleasure. Can you give me a list of books that will make them want to read for pleasure? And I'm like, well, okay, magic list. But because she also wanted the books to be challenging. I said, first of all, I have to ask you 2 questions. Do your children see you read for pleasure? Because if they don't, there's no magic words I can say. There's no magic list of books that I can give you that will make because if you don't prioritize reading for pleasure, how on earth is someone else going to convey that to them? And number 2, I asked her, when your kids are reading for pleasure, what do they read? And this still kills me. It still makes me mad every time I hear it. She said, well, they love those Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, but I threw those away because those are stupid. So I had to do a lot of explaining with her about literacy and about the 30-30-30 rule of 30% being easy, 30% being on reading level, and 30% being above. And I had to talk to her about the fact that if you say to your child that what your child loves is stupid, not only are you taking away a comfort read for them, which is so important, and especially during COVID, we saw this. Lots of kids went back and watched cartoons from their childhood, read books from their childhood, because the predictability of those books gives children comfort. And the predictability part of that is that knowing that you have mastery of that thing. So anyway, with this mom, I mean, essentially what she was saying was, I'm not going to role model that for them, and I'm going to denigrate their choices. And that's the exact opposite of what we want to do. We want to cheer them on when they're doing the things that, are important to us as a family in terms of learning. And sometimes that's going to mean you have to go out and do things that are scary for you. If it's learning a new instrument, learning a new language. A friend of mine just learned Spanish in her 50s, and her kids were so impressed by that they decided to try to learn a new language as well, the same language, so they could all practice together. I mean, this is something that we have to do sort of every day. Pick something. I have a board behind me that has little lights. It's called the Everyday Calendar, and it's by someone, I can't remember how to pronounce her last name. It's like Geertz. It's Giertz. And every day she made it so that she would remind herself to meditate every day. So when she meditates, she presses the little light and it turns on and it shows that she meditated that day. And for me, I pick just one goal every single day. Just one goal. I don't care what it is. It could be meditating. It could be taking a walk. It could be remembering to get up every 15 minutes while I'm writing today. And then I get to light up the little light. And it's just a little way of reminding myself that every single day I have to remember that I have to challenge myself to some small thing every single day, and making sure my kids know I do that is part of it.
I want that board.
It's really good. So you can get it. I'll send you the link for where to get it. It's not cheap, but Simone is someone I really respect. She, I have to say a bad word here, but she has a YouTube channel where she builds what she calls shitty robots. And her entire channel is about building things that may be useful only to her, and making a lot of mistakes, and, having lots of prototypes and making lots of mistakes. And this was a project that she built. She also turned a Tesla into a truck and calls it the Truckla. She really wanted a Tesla truck. They didn't make them, so she made one. And she's amazing. And everyone should check her out on YouTube, because she's amazing.
And I like what you're saying too. And I think teachers can, reflect on that same idea of, are we demonstrating with our students? So one of the things I think, just as an example, when I was a fourth grade teacher, we always had, well, not every day, but a lot of times we had 30 minutes of silent reading, right? Where you got to read your book from the library. Mm-hmm. Now, as a teacher, are you also reading a book during that 30 minutes? Mm-hmm. Or are you like setting up like, this is 30 minutes of reading. I'm also going to be reading a book because I need it quiet in here too, because I'm reading a book with you. Or am I saying this is 30 minutes for you to be quiet so that I can go answer emails, get on my computer, check my phone, right? What's the message that you're sending to your students when we say, I want you to read for 30 minutes because I know it's good for you and I want you to have some fun and pleasure in reading. But for me, it's time to go get work done.
Remember when
I'm going to pick up a book and read with you.
Do you remember when I said that I give all the kids my email address and then I tell them to email me? It's always, spoiler alert, it's always like 8 to 10 things. It's usually just these 8 to 10 things. There's one thing that is by far the biggest thing that they tell me. One of them, though, that's usually buried in somewhere around 3 or 4 in terms of how often I get these requests, is if I'm being told that I have to get off my device, that I need to spend time in the real world and off a screen, doesn't that also kind of mean that my parents should be doing that too? Like, where's this hypocrisy coming from? And that's one of the, our kids, and you guys know this, our kids are watching way more than they're listening. Like, they're processing what we actually do, not what we're saying to them. And so as a teacher, there were certain things I had to role model. I always had an index card on the front of my plan book, and that was always questions that need answering or looking up tonight. And if I said I was going to look something up, or if I said I was going to find the answer to something or get something right the next day, I had to do it because I had to show follow through. And those little examples that we give to our kids of whether it's responsibility or, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to look that up tonight and figure that out. Or you asked the question, Robbie, over there. Robbie, why don't you look that up for us tonight? And then you can report back tomorrow and tell us what you learned. And just that enthusiasm for learning. And I've said this a million times, but if you're a teacher where you've gotten to the point where you're just coasting, where you haven't updated your lesson plan since 1972, where you just don't care anymore, maybe it's time to get out, because if you don't care, they don't care. I mean, it's just that simple. And it's the same thing for parenting.
Thank you so much for all of the insight, for, again, sharing about the book. And of course, beyond, I think the timing of this episode is positioned to sort of be a little bit of a call to action. I really like that we've come back and we've brought this to ourselves. Like, the call to action for me is maybe, in this new academic year, how am I going to give myself the gift of failure, right? That willingness to try, experiment. And if it doesn't go well, it doesn't destroy me. It's going to present me with some new information that will be useful. And I love what you said about, the idea of goals over grades, and having that as a conversation that maybe is just literally in-house. So I'm going to take that on as well, to really think about just sharing goals with like a small inner circle and getting curious about, I like that you talked too about, for younger learners, like the mini steps of getting there. And I think that's important for us too. So I'm going to get curious about my own mini steps. So Jessica, thank you so much. Again, folks, the book, The Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed. Lots of links over there in the show notes to learn about that, as well as your more recent book. Jessica, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, this is talking about education is one of my favorite things in the whole world. So thank you so much for the opportunity.